What's your favorite creepy campfire story? Please like and subscribe to support this channel. Typical Filipino stories. Almost all schools are Catholic schools in my country, and they're either built over a cemetery and/or used to be a barracks, hospital during WW2. Maria Labo. Though I think this one is just from our island, but I do remember reading about it in a national horror magazine, so it must have spread. Poor woman goes to London to work as a caregiver. She comes back as an aswang ghoul. Cooks up her children. Her husband finds out and slices her face with a labo or machete. Now she roams the countryside searching for her next meal. This caused so much panic in my town that the radio station had to issue a statement that it was just a folktale. Tionic. If you're out hiking in the woods during dusk or night and you hear a baby crying, do not help it, just run away. It will eat you. 100 years ago, out in the waters around Spivey Point, a small clipper ship drew toward land. Suddenly, out of the night, the fog rolled in. For a moment, they could see nothing, not a foot in front of them. Then, they saw a light. By God, it was a fire burning on the shore, strong enough to penetrate the swirling mist. They steered a course toward the light. But it was a campfire, like this one. The ship crashed against the rocks, the hull sheared in two, mast snapped like a twig. The wreckage sank, with all the men aboard. At the bottom of the sea, lay the Elizabeth Dane, with her crew, their lungs filled with salt water, their eyes open, staring to the darkness. And above, as suddenly as it come, the fog lifted, receded back across the ocean and never came again. But it is told by the fishermen, and their fathers and grandfathers, that when the fog returns to Antonio Bay, the men at the bottom of the sea, out in the water by Spivey Point, will rise up and search for the campfire that led them to their dark, icy death. There were a couple that were, as far as I know, unique to the church camp, Camp Gaylor Maxon, I went to as a kid. Though I admit it's possible some of our stories were ubiquitous ones just adapted to the place, I don't really know. One of them, though, I do have first-hand knowledge about. It's the story of Sydney. The camp was established on an old piece of property that has been a lot of different things over the years. Back during the war, it was a girls' boarding school. One girl who was there was deeply in love with a boy who had gone off to fight. They exchanged letters constantly, until one day the letters stopped coming. Few weeks later, she gets word that her beloved was killed in action. She was so distraught that she hanged herself in her dorm room. There's still a plaque by the door of the room in her memory. Now, I know for a fact that room is haunted. I stayed in that room 1 year when I worked for the camp. One night after lights out, the fan came on by itself. It started spinning faster and faster until it started wobbling really hard, acting like it's about to fall off. I knew the stories, so I shouted, "Stop it, Sydney. I'm a friend." Fan immediately stopped. Not just slowed down and came to an eventual stop. It's like someone grabbed the fan blades and stopped it. The golden arm, or at least the version my mom tells. A fellow is looking to be married to one of the rich merchant's daughters to gain the fortune that would come with her. Fortunately, the merchant had an unmarried daughter still, so the fellow begins to court her. The first thing he noticed is that she had a solid gold right arm. She apparently lost it in a childhood accident, and her father had a golden arm forged for her. Seeing this as a sign of extreme wealth, he continued with courting her, making her believe he truly loved her and not for her father's money. In turn, she fell deeply in love with him. They get married, and the fellow is given his riches along with part of the merchant business his now father-in-law owned, thus giving him more money. However, he soon realized his wife was now of no real use, so he ignored her, gave her gifts and had dinner with her, but the love he said he felt had disappeared. Angry and heartbroken, the daughter accused him of marrying her for her money, in which he boldly states of course. She was furious, screaming about going to tell her father what a scoundrel he truly was, and their riches would be stripped away along with his job. This angered the fellow. After all he worked so hard to get to here, he wasn't going to let her take it away. So he pushed her down the cellar stairs and let her snap her neck on the stone. He pled heartbroken to the grief-stricken father, losing his most favorite daughter, the fellow's riches intact. The fellow and family hold a funeral for the daughter and weep and cry. When it was but him and his dead wife, he opened the casket and pulled out a saw, for she did not need her golden arm in the grave. That night he slept with the arm under his pillow, not wanting even the servants to see it before he melts it down into bars. He slept soundly until a voice like the wind asks, "Where's my golden arm?" Slow and far away the voice echoed through the sleeping house, so quiet he thought it was just a draft. Until the voice came again, closer and louder this time, as it down the hall, "Where's my golden arm?" Sitting up, the fellow looked around fearfully, too scared to do anything as he hears again much closer, "Where's my golden arm?" He felt a heat on his back and a movement from under his pillow, but he was too scared to look away from the door as he hears again, just outside the frame, the wail of, "Where's my golden arm?" It felt like hell fire on his back as he felt the hot metal of the hand on his back, seemingly crawling on its own as he watches the doorknob turn. The maid found his body that morning, face frozen in horror and hair a bright white, hands still clutching the sheets around his body. But the strangest thing was that his dead wife's golden arm was on his chest, hand wrapped tightly around his throat. Sorry this is long, but this is the first time I've written this story out. It's always been verbally told, smiley face. It's pretty simple and I will not drag it out. So here it goes. One day my neighbor walked over into my backyard while I was in my garden. He looked disheveled and was wearing pajamas. When I stood up I noticed his eyes were sunken in and it looked as if he lost a lot of weight. I tried to crack a joke about how this would be a great day to go down to the beach if it were not for the weather being so cold. But the joke fell flat. A week later I bumped into his wife at the post office. She was in line in front of me mailing about a dozen packages. I asked if her husband was feeling better because he looked a bit under the weather last week when he was in my backyard. She tells me I must have been mistaken. He passed away over a month ago from cancer. The packages she was mailing were his action figure toy collection she sold online. I was speechless. Was I crazy? Maybe I did misjudge the weekend I thought I saw him. Then I really thought hard. I did not remember him saying anything to me. I did remember telling him the joke and it falling flat. I assumed I wasn't funny and that's why he didn't laugh. Or maybe he couldn't because it may have been just his spirit. When I returned home from the post office I immediately start telling my wife about our neighbor. Before I could get out he had passed away from cancer, she says. Oh yeah, I saw you guys talking last weekend. And then I tell her about seeing his wife at the post office and being told about his passing. So we go to our security camera and play back the video from the week before. It's clear in the video that I do stand up. It's obvious I'm acknowledging the presence of someone and have a brief conversation. And then I go back to tending to my garden. But on the video the entire time I was the only person in my backyard. It was a cold, dreary night, with misting rains and a chilling breeze. Me and Annie, my uncle, were coming back from visiting our cousin who lived upstate. With another 20 miles to get home we pulled off the interstate and started down a rural stretch of highway that led to our small town. Just off the edge of the interstate exit ramp we saw a man, standing in the cold rain with a bag over his shoulder and his thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. My uncle pointed the man out. Look at that poor son of a bitch. I looked at my uncle. Should we give him a ride? My uncle shrugged his shoulders. I pulled the car to side and the man jogged up to our window. Where you headed, buddy? Elmdale, the man said. Elmdale was a tiny town about 15 miles up the highway. Most of the town died out after the Great Depression. There wasn't much left but a few scattered houses and the county cemetery. We agreed to give the man a ride, and he climbed into the backseat of our car. My uncle and I were both pretty tired, so we didn't try to make conversation, we just drove in silence. That is, until we heard giggling in the backseat. We looked in the rear-view mirror. The hitchhiker had his bag, a green canvas army surplus style pack, opened up. We couldn't see what was inside, but he was staring into it with a big smile on his face. He whispered into the bag, "Shish, I know, soon enough, they'll see." And then he giggled again. By this time he notices we are looking in the rear-view mirror at him. He hastily closes the bag and looks out the window like nothing's happened. My uncle asks, "Hey buddy, what's in the bag?" The hitchhiker gets an enraged look on his face. "None of your damned business." Me and my uncle exchange glances. Maybe this was a bad idea. A ride in silence for a few more miles. I speed up to try and get to Elmdale faster so we can get this creep out of our car. Then we hear the whispering again. "Close now, darling, won't be long. Be ready when the time comes." Again we see that he's got his bag open and is talking down into it. I clear my throat and say, "Do you have a pet in that bag or something?" The hitchhiker looks bewildered. "A pet?" He starts looking around the car. "No, I mean in your bag. What's in your bag?" The hitchhiker stares defiantly back at me in the rear-view mirror. "None of your damned business." I push the gas pedal down further. Up ahead, through the rain, I can see the edge of the county cemetery coming into view. We are close. The hitchhiker starts laughing. It's a maniacal laugh, like the kind you'd hear echoing down the hall of a psych ward. He's got his bag open, staring down inside. I hear my uncle say, "Fuck this," and it's all the encouragement I need. I brake hard and pull the car roughly onto the shoulder. We are just outside the cemetery gates. I throw the transmission in park and yell, "Get the fuck out of the car." My uncle springs from his seat. In a second he's out his door and ripping open the rear passenger door. He grabs the hitchhiker and yanks him out. The hitchhiker shrieks and pulls a box cutter from his jacket. Just as he extends the blade, my uncle punches him in jaw. The hitchhiker stumbles back and takes a hard fall into a seated position. Instantly my uncle and I are back in the car. I throw the transmission in drive and floor it. We pull away and in the rear view I can see the hitchhiker. He's spinning in the road, slashing air with his box cutter, shrieking at the top of his lungs. In a matter of seconds he fades from view. The car is up to speed and he is long gone. In the confusion my uncle wasn't able to close the rear door. The momentum has partially pressed it closed but it rattles, slightly ajar. My uncle reaches over the seat to pull it shut. "Oh shit," he says. "What?" He left his bag in the back seat. We exchange glances as he pulls the bag into the front seat. Hesitantly he pulls the flap open, his hand freezes in place, his eyes bulge. Holy shit. I ask him what it is but he's unable to speak. Instead he turns the bag toward me and pulls the flap all the way open so that I finally peer inside. And do you know what was in that bag? None of your damned business. I was lost in the woods as night was falling. I'd been walking all day and was desperate to find somewhere to shelter. In the darkness I came across a lonely cabin, and without even thinking I knocked on the door. When there was no answer, I decided to try the handle. The door was unlocked. I got in and threw myself on the single bed in the middle of the room. I felt bad about breaking in, but I was exhausted and fell asleep almost instantly. In the middle of the night, I woke up. But something kept me from going back to sleep. I hadn't noticed before, but on the wooden walls hung the most sinister paintings I'd ever seen. They were portraits. Horrible portraits of faces twisted in rage and fear, as if all the ugliness in the world was glaring down at me. Lying there in the dark, I shivered and somehow knew that the faces in the paintings were looking at me as an intruder. And how they hated me for it. Eventually my tiredness must have overcome my fear and I drifted off into the darkness of a dreamless sleep. That morning when I woke up, with the call of the forest birds flitting through the air, I opened my eyes, but I almost wished I hadn't. Because when I looked around the sagging walls, I realized that those things I'd seen the night before weren't paintings at all. They were windows. This is a pretty common one, but it always scared the crap out of my little cousins. Here it goes. There once was a girl named Mary Sue. She would always wear a bow around her neck. The kids at school would always say, "Mary Sue, Mary Sue. Take off that bow, will you?" But she refused. In high school, her best friends asked her to take it off as they had gone out of fashion, but Mary Sue refused. One day Mary Sue met the man of her dreams and he asked her to take off her bow, but she replied, "One day you will find out." Almost 60 years later, after Mary Sue's children had grown up and moved out, Mary Sue went up to her husband. "Do you want to see what is under my bow?" she asked. Her husband put down his newspaper. "Are you sure? You've never taken it off." "I am sure, my love," Mary Sue said, pulling the end of her bow. The bow fell to the ground shortly, followed by her head, then the rest of her body. So a story I always tell around a campfire that I think is quite spooky is the legend of El Silban, the whistling ghost. It's a Venezuelan folktale, but I have a tradition of telling it. Anyway, the legend goes that on cold dark nights in remote places, especially in South America, a whistle can be heard coming down the road. At first it will seem loud, like it's right next to you, but as time passes it begins to fade and get more and more quiet until it's almost gone. The trick is, as El Silban's whistle gets louder, he's further away, and when he's right next to you the whistle is very faint and sounds like it's far away. Once El Silban is at your doorstep, he will sit down and begin to count the skulls of his victims, and you have to listen to him count every single skull, or one of your family members will die soon after and become one of his skulls. El Silban is said to dress like a farmer with a large straw hat, torn clothes, ghostly aura and a pale dead face. It's not that scary, but it's interesting. Gotta apologize if I don't do it justice, I only heard it told once years back. We were on a scout trip in northern Utah. Was a short trip with some light hiking, fishing, merit badge work, etc. According to the scout leader, the place was called Mirror Lake, and he had an old friend who'd camped out there before, some 25 years before. This friend was there with 2 other guys, all in their mid-20s. I can't remember the names, so we'll say they were Steve, Mike, and Jacob. They had a very tame fishing trip, no alcohol or any other substance that could have upped the chances that events were being misremembered, misinterpreted, scary when it wasn't, etc. But on the final night of the trip, they'd called it a night, settled in for bed, and Steve fell asleep. Not long later, he and Mike woke up in the tent, to a noise in the distance, presumably an animal echoing from across the lake. As they came to, they noticed Jacob was missing. At first, they didn't assume anything was wrong. He was probably just going to the bathroom, and would be back any minute. But as they waited, they gradually got more uneasy and worried. Eventually they decided to go find him, as they were just beginning their search of the near area, but before they started calling his name out as loud as they could, they heard an ear-splitting, inhuman screech, followed by Jacob's blood-curdling scream. Scared out of their wits, they rushed back to their tent. With hushed voices and tears in their eyes, survival became the primary concern. They prayed that whoever or whatever had their friend had happened upon him while he was out looking for a spot to go to the bathroom, so it wouldn't known where their tent was. The plan became to sleep in shifts through the night and get back to the city at the first sign of light, and inform the officials so they could hopefully save Jacob, or whatever remained of him. Things went well for the first few shifts, so they began to relax, and hope that they would survive the night began to grow. The time came again for Steve to rest, and this time he was able to fall asleep more quickly, and sleep more deeply with his mind less on edge and the fatigue piling up. But not long later, he was roused from his sleep as Mike was rustling around the tent. Steve sat up, and saw that Mike was getting his shoes on. He asked him where he was going, but Mike didn't respond, or acknowledge his question. Concern growing as the grogginess faded and the situation came back to him, Steve got out of his sleeping bag, and grabbed his friend by the shoulder. When he faced Mike head-on, his face was blank, but his eyes were wide and glazed over, as reflective as a mirror, or as the lake. He was muttering something about needing to go, and continued getting ready to leave the tent, almost in a trance. Steve thought he was just tired, and not being careful, so he tried to talk him out of going out, saying to wait till it was light so they could pack up and hike back to the car. But Mike kept ignoring him. As Steve started to get a little more rough with Mike to try to shake him out of it, they heard a noise much the same as the one they heard before, but not nearly as far as across the lake. This was the first thing that got Mike's attention, and his whole body went tense as the flashlight reflected off his glossed eyes, and he began to rush, seeming to be in a hurry to get out of the tent and join whatever was out there. Steve went into full panic mode, unsure of what to do, but he was resolved to not let Mike go out there and be taken or killed as Jacob had. He was trying to hold Mike back, but Mike struggled against him, unshakable in his trance. Mike broke free, and began to unzip the main entrance, when Steve tackled him away, pinning him down with his body weight and clamping a hand over Mike's mouth in case he tried to call the thing over. For what felt like years Steve stayed there, barely dating to breathe, resisting Mike's attempts to wriggle free or speak, sure that he hadn't come back to himself yet. Finally, as the light of morning began to work its way through the trees, Mike stopped struggling, and the mirror left his eyes. Steve asked him why he had been trying to leave, but Mike had no memory of this. In a flurry they broke down their camp, basically sprinted through the winding trail back to their car, and sped till they could get cell reception to call the police. I never asked my scout leader after the trip if he really knew a guy that claimed this stuff had really happened, or if he just made it up, come across the story from someone else telling it. But he was a smart guy, so I could see him coming up with it on the spot to make it feel real and tied to where we were camping to freak us out. I was definitely unsettled, but some of the other boys were scared out of their minds. Later that night, we were settling in to go to bed when we realized one boy had fallen asleep in the tent while we'd all been chatting. So we were cruel enough to all leave the tent and then try to wake him up and make him think we'd all been taken under the mirror's trance. He was pretty scared for about 2 minutes before someone gave it up and went and told him, but if it had been up to me I'd have held out and let him freak out a while longer. This was an awesome question and a great thread to read and get me thinking back to this and other great camping trips. I've posted this before. One year, a group of us went camping in Kearney, Ontario, where we always go camping. Whenever we go, we always form our tents in a big circle, with the fire pit in the middle of us. We've been drinking, smoking a few joints, and a few of us were tripping balls on shrooms. The first night we were there, this guy randomly walks into our circle, introduces himself, I can't remember the name he gave, that he was in the military and decided to take some vacation to camp out a bit. He asked if he could join our fire, as it was getting late and he didn't buy any firewood. Being the friendly stoned people we are, we let him join our fire. He even pitched in some money for the firewood. The night went on and we all were having a good time. One by one, our group started heading off to bed, me being either the second or third. I remember waking up to the sound of someone talking and the fire being started. It was 4 in the morning. I peeped out my tent and saw the random just sitting on a log by the fire, talking to himself. Still tripping on shrooms, I thought to myself I am in no condition to deal with this and chalked it up to me just tripping out. I wake up the next day and everyone is still alive, thankfully, and the fire is smoldering. We looked to the next campsite, where the random was staying, and it was spotless, no garbage, no tracks in the trail around the site, no nothing. We all started talking about him, just to be sure we all saw him. Through talking, we managed to figure out that he must not have slept at all. The last 2 of our group passed out just after 3:30 am. The first person got up just after 6 am and noticed he was gone. The rest of the camping trip went well and we all went home. Fast forward maybe 4 to 5 years, I flip on the news and there is a picture of someone I could swear I recognize. He was arrested for a bunch of crimes, including rape and murder. Guess who it was? It was the random guy who joined our fire. I don't know why I remembered his face, but I guess it was just a weird situation where my brain right-clicked and saved as a JPEG in my brain. Now, I have no way of proving if it was the same guy. We didn't take any pictures of the random, but the picture jump-started my memory and made me instantly remember the weird random fire joiner. Either that, or they looked identical to the same person. Either way, was creepy. Why I'm no longer a park ranger. When I was a park ranger, I usually worked the day shift, but there had lately been a lot of night shift guys quitting. It was obviously inevitable that I would be asked to do night shift. I arrived at the watchtower at 5 p.m. The watchtower was next to one of those large ponds, small lakes. I climbed up the stairs to the top and entered the tower room. There was one clear glass wall and 3 wooden opaque walls. Inside was a bed with a nightstand next to it on the right. There was also a kitchenette with 2 sets of cabinets on the left-hand side. Next to the glass wall on the far side of the room was a radio communication station. On the nightstand was a flashlight. Inside the nightstand were a pair of binoculars and a long-range walkie-talkie. Inside the small cabinets was food. I couldn't open the big cabinets for some reason. There was most likely stuff in there that were above my pay grade. Around the watchtower room was a walkway. Anyways, I went to the communication station and radioed my partner Donnie, who was at the main ranger station. I said, "Well Donnie, it looks like it's just us tonight." He didn't reply though, so I assumed he was in the bathroom. So I took the binoculars and walkie-talkie and stepped onto the walkway. I scanned the far ridge, the roads, and the forest below. I was looking for illegal campsites, troublemakers, and other riffraff. As I passed my binoculars across the far ridge, I saw what looked like a snowman. I had a double take and thought, a snowman? In the middle of July? I looked again and saw that it wasn't a snowman but a kid wearing a ghost costume, just staring at the watchtower. The costume was a sheet pulled over with 2 eye holes cut out, like the ghost costumes in Charlie Brown. So I radioed Donnie again and asked, "Hey Donnie, are you there?" Donnie responded, "Yeah, I just made it out." I got a chuckle out of that. Donnie was always good for a laugh. I then said, "Yeah. Say, can you check out the ridge? I saw a kid up there wearing a ghost costume. You know, a sheet with eye holes cut out. You mean like from Charlie Brown Halloween?" he asked. Yes. Donnie then left the ranger station and headed for the ridge. About 40 minutes later, the sun had set and it was a bit dark. I scanned the ridge again, but the kid in the ghost costume was gone. So I radioed Donnie again. "Are you there?" Donnie responded, "I'm almost at the ridge." "What's up?" I said. "You might want to search the surrounding area, the kid has moved." "Sure thing." About 10 minutes later, I saw Donnie's flashlight shining on the ridge in the distance. I looked in my binoculars and saw Donnie shining the light around and Donnie shrugging. He then radioed me and said, "I don't see anyone H." Donnie's flashlight then went out and there was just static on the radio. I spoke into the radio, "Donnie? Donnie? Donnie? Are you there? What happened?" Just then I heard a loud shriek coming from the base of the tower. I shined my flashlight down and saw, right between the tower and the pond, a pale, blue woman with empty eye sockets staring at me. All of her limbs looked broken and bent in the wrong way. Just then she started sprinting up the stairs towards the top where I was. I had never seen anyone move that fast. She was running faster than Olympic runners. I freaked out, ran inside, grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find, locked the door, and hid next to it. There was no way she could run up those steps that fast, even if her limbs weren't broken. Then I heard the sound of one of the big cabinets opening. My blood ran cold. I slowly looked over at the cabinets to see one of the big ones wide open with the ghost from the ridge looking right at me. I froze in fear. That is until I heard it giggling. I recognized that giggle. I pulled off the sheet and saw it was one of Donnie's kids. He pulled out a walkie-talkie and said, "Hey Dad, we got him." I heard Donnie's voice come over the radio. "Ha ha ha, good job." I grabbed that walkie-talkie and said, "Ha ha, very funny you jerk." Donnie replied, "Yeah, listening to you scream like a girl was the best bit." I responded, "Yeah, screw you too, Donnie. By the way, that wasn't me who screamed, that was that zombie chick at the stairs." "Who was that, your wife?" Donnie hesitated in responding and just stuttered out, "Am my wife? Do ghosts look like zombies from that distance? You said it yourself, it looked like a Charlie Brown ghost." I then said, "Not the ghosts. There was a woman at the bottom of the tower. She shrieked and ran up the stairs faster than an Olympic runner." Donnie then said, Yeah. I didn't put a woman on the stairs. Needless to say, I put in my resignation when my shift was over. I'm 60 years old now, but when I was 11, I went to a summer camp in Middletown, CA, run by a religious order called the Salesian. This property was gifted to them, as long as they used it to help or do good with kids, so they made a summer camp out of it. My dad didn't have any money, but he knew priests, so we got to go to camp for free. That's when I heard about Stoggy. Stoggy was the Jason sort of character that preyed upon the camp, but this was way before all those movies and I was 11, so I thought this shit was real. I was like, OMG. Ha ha, was fun. Some kids pissed their sleeping bags and eventually, I think there was some litigation, so that all stopped. At least I wasn't molested. I still think of Stoggy though. We have old one here in Saw Farmer, while on his way home, is caught in a terrible thunderstorm with his horse. Completely lost, he realizes he will either freeze to death or get struck by lightning if he doesn't find a place to stay. Through the storm, he comes across a small homestead, the yellow candlelight visible through the sheets of rain. Lighting flashes brightly, thunder barely a breath later, and he leads his terrified horse to the small house. Tying the petrified animal to the fence, he knocks on the door and an old lady opens it with a smile. She ushers him in and he finds her husband smoking a pipe. He is seated at the kitchen table, and the wife quickly boils the kettle and gives him a bowl of hot soup and a cup of coffee. The farmer tells the old couple his story, and they are happy to serve as his sanctuary against the storm. Outside, the lightning flashes again, followed with a bout of thunder, and the old man smiles when jumps, offering him a bit of tobacco for his pipe to calm his nerves. The farmer accepts gratefully. The next bolt slams close, ripping through the ground, almost deafening him completely. He jumps up with a cry, startled out of his wits, only to find himself standing in the dark and cold. Soaked wet by the rain, with no sign of the couple, broken stones littered around him, and his horse tied to a tree branch. Without thinking, he jumps on his spooked horse and gallops as fast as he can away from the place. He would reach a town sometime during the night. At a tavern, after sharing his story, the folks tell him of the small cottage nearby which had been struck by lightning a long time ago, and of the couple that was killed in the fire. Writing this out simply for the sake of having it written because I cannot find a single reference to it anywhere online, and it scared the absolute shit out of me when I was a 12-year-old Boy Scout. As told by a counselor, when my uncle attended university in the early 80s, he was among a group of fraternity brothers responsible for recruiting freshmen, who went through a particular kind of hazing, involving a supposed haunted house a few miles from campus. An old 3-story Victorian-style mansion left abandoned and withering away to the elements after, rumor has it, the father of the family that resided within had one day gone mad and murdered his wife and 3 children with a hatchet and then hung himself from the 2nd-story stairwell. The hazing involved sending 3 freshman potential fraternity recruits to said house, at 3 a.m., 2 equipped with a unique item relating to the murders and all 3 with a candle and a match. The freshmen would be sent one at a time to the house, observed from afar bt the frat boys. They were instructed to enter the house, light their candle, and ascend each floor until they got to the attic. They were told to stop at each main picture window of each floor and let their candle show in the window, to prove they were actually there and completing the challenge. My uncle was a senior member of the fraternity, and he ended up having a worse outcome than anyone else involved. So the night comes, the fated night that changed multiple people's lives irreversibly, forever. My uncle, 4 of his frat brothers and 3 freshman potential frat brothers arrive at a small bridge on the outskirts of the house around 2:30 a.m. The night is cold and still, clouds ride across an almost full moon, illuminating the old house and casting eerie shadows. The 3 freshmen are given separate items alongside their candles and matches. The first gets a hatchet, representing the murder weapon. The second is given a rope, representing the suicide method. The third is given a second match, because he's told it's almost certain his candle will not burn true after the first 2 ascend the stairs and disturb the spirits. So my uncle, the frat brothers, and the other 2 freshmen watch as the first recruit approaches the old house with a hatchet, a candle, and a match in hand. Nervously, he enters, and in the dark night, the rest can plainly see the match strike, light, and ignite the candle. This house had many large picture windows, and the whole group watches as a glow illuminates the first floor windows, passing one by one, until the stairs, when it begins to rise, first floor, second floor, and then the candle goes out. They spectate for a minute, most likely a draft, or moving too fast from panic, so they send the second freshman recruit, equipped with a rope, candle and match. And eerily enough, the same events unfold. First floor, second floor, and the candle goes out. The third and last recruit is obviously shaken, but the frat brothers try to rationalize the situation by explaining that the other 2 recruits are probably just messing with them. Holed up in the second floor, laughing in the dark and sipping on a hip flask. My uncle says he didn't believe this, but he just laughed and agreed to ease the tension. So they send the third freshman to investigate, give his buddies a kick in the ass and remind them that they can't join the frat unless they make it to the attic and prove it with the candle glowing in the window. With nothing but a candle and 2 matches, the third visibly trembling freshman approaches the house, gives an apprehensive look back to the group, then enters. Again, it happens, the same thing, first floor, second floor, and the candle goes out. It doesn't relight, despite the second match. My uncle and his buddies are perplexed. Do these guys just not want to join the frat? Are they just screwing with them to be cocky or prove something? It's got to be freezing, dark and miserable in that old house. What do they have to gain? So they wait. And wait. And wait. 2 hours have passed, the beer has all been drunk and my uncle and his frat buddies are just annoyed at this point. So they say fuck it, leave em. Let the freshmen enjoy their little prank and sit in the cold and dark, not going to give them the satisfaction. So they go back to the dorm and sleep it off, eager to see the freshman recruits the next day and inform them that they failed the test and hope it was worth it. But the freshmen never show up. In fact, they still haven't showed up the next day either. Nervous, my uncle and his buddies decide to investigate the old house before getting police involved and potentially a massive scandal. Well, what they found, my uncle never forgot or forgave himself. At the top of the second floor stairway, they found the first freshman, face down in a pool of blood with the hatchet buried in his head. Hanging by the rope he brought was the second freshman, dangling from the second floor railing. Panicked and horrified, they called the police. The third freshman was never found, but there were footprints in the dust leading up the stairs, and out an open window. The police never found him, and he is believed to the top suspect. Why would he kill his friends? No known motive, but he's the only suspect and is still missing to this day. After an extensive investigation, no charges are filed on the frat or my uncle due to lack of evidence. My uncle's fraternity completely disbanded after the incident. Hazing gone wrong ends in 2 grisly deaths, the paper said. Big mess swept under the rug. But then the incident started happening. Now here's the even more peculiar part of the whole mess. Each year, almost on the dot, the night of the deaths of those 2 freshmen, my uncle's frat brothers started dropping like flies, one at a time. Grief-stricken suicide, alcoholism, tragic accident. Each was explained away and forgotten. Only my uncle seemed to draw the connection and it haunted him for the rest of his life. until he was the last one left. 12 years later, he found himself the last of his fraternity to be alive, and the anniversary was approaching. Terrified, he panicked, sold all his worldly possessions and decided to live the vagrant rail-riding hobo lifestyle. Who knows why? We certainly don't. All we know is how he was found, 2 days after the anniversary. He was found at a railway station by a worker unloading boxcars. He was found alone, dead and cold, a horrible shocked look frozen on his face. Beside him was a candle and 2 burned-out matches, and scratched into the door of the boxcar was "Ah." That's when you scream and scare the ever-loving shit out of a bunch of 12-year-old Boy Scouts and have them hike in the dark back to their camp. Good time. The lore of my cottage that my great-great-uncle watches over it. Mostly because I saw an apparition of a man at 2 to 3 in the morning when I was a young kid when I went to use the bathroom. Rocking chairs would move by themselves. I once heard an unknown man speaking in my room at my cottage, but the only males at the time were my brother and I and my cousin, except my brother and I were young kids. My cousin had just started puberty, and this sounded like an older man who smoked a lot, and a few years ago when another cousin was staying there, she saw an apparition of a man sitting at her computer chair in her room. The same room I stayed in as a kid. It's both creepy but assuring having someone watching over us. I don't know if this will be seen, but hoping 1 or 2 people see this. For starter, our house is from the 1800s and we've been renovating it for the last 3-5 years, and we've heard that a previous owner died here. One night I was coming downstairs to get a glass of water when I saw a white figure floating about an inch off the ceiling, which is 8 feet tall. I was a little shaken up, and I run upstairs and back to bed. About a year later, my parent bought a camper with a built-in radio. After about 2 months of having the camper, the radio in it mysteriously turned on. My dad heard it and then turned it off. Then a few days later, the radio turned back on, and the cycle repeated until the battery died. After a year after the radio kept going off, I had finally moved into my bedroom after it was finished. One night I was watching YouTube, and I heard a shushing noise when all of my family was asleep. I heard the shushing noise a few times after that. The last thing that had happened was in July. I was on a FaceTime call with one of my friends, and I was fidgeting with some coins I had. I stood one up on its edge, and was going to stand another one up, but I'd fell too many times, so I gave up and swiped it onto the floor. After that I went downstairs to refill my water bottle because my mouth was dry from talking. I go back upstairs. About 5 minutes later I went back upstairs to find the coin that was on the floor back on my desk standing on its edge. I went downstairs and asked if anyone had gone up to my room, and everybody said no, so I went back up to my room and heard that same shushing sound. Now one of my best friend has been telling me that he's been hearing a shushing sound occasionally when he's home alone. My father was a man of extensive creative talents, prone to the odd tale of whimsy and horror as the mood might take him. I recall one story in particular, seared into my memory and piercing the veil of time to visit me on occasion even now. It spoke of a civilization that hung on the precipice. How the city teetered on the edge of disaster, the waves of destruction crashing into the shoals beneath the cliff it resided upon. All of the people in this civilization saw the threat, were fully aware of the impending doom, but they did nothing to halt its progress. The challenge resided in their need to rely upon each other, to place the concerns of the future above the trivial but more immediate desires of the present. They consoled themselves by protesting that the city upon the cliff had stood for generations and it had never fallen into the sea. Surely it would last for a generation longer. There was no need to change their behavior now, with history being so eloquent an excuse to continue as they had. And so they built as those who had come before them had built. The buildings grew higher, the wells bored deeper, the people and their things became ever more numerous. Each person added the merest feather to the load, and each believed their feather could surely not be responsible for any consequences. It was but a feather. A feather would not break the earth, could not be the final burden which broke the soil beneath the city and caused it to tumble into the sea. Besides, why should they give up their feathers if others did not? And so each person lived as they desired, heedless of the cracks slowly winding their way up the pavement, careless of the small quakes that rumbled beneath. They paid no mind to these inconvenient harbingers, for there were things to build, desires to fulfill, dreams to live that could not be forestalled in favor of imagined nightmares far off. The city grew and grew, each living for themselves, a great collection of individuals but not a society, a civilization of humans without humanity. Feather upon feather was added. Then came the final feather. A great groan sounded out, and the world began to tilt and shift. Screeching pierced the night as the tip of the cliff sheared off, dooming the city on the hill to the death of the sea below. In the briefest of moments, the project of generations was reduced to ruins, and a great future of possibility was lost. I called out to my father, wondering why the people would fail to heed the warnings. Wondering why they would give up so much in service of so little. He leaned forward and laid a hand on my shoulder, his eyes sad and distant, and he whispered, "That, my child, is the way people are." Quote, I remember one of my Cub Scout leaders told us on a camp out when I was Prop 7. It took place during pioneer times. A man and his wife traveled west in hopes of either striking it rich with gold, or at worst, finding a nice plot of land to settle down on and farm. Manifest destiny and whatnot, a few months into their journey they come across just the spot. A beautiful plot of land to make their new home. Winter would be coming in a couple months, so they build a hasty shack and figure they'll hunker down there for the winter, and build a more established house in a few months when the weather is more permitting. They don't worry, as the area is teeming with wildlife for hunting and trapping, so they figure they'll be set for food. A couple of months go by and the winter is bitter cold and unrelenting. They've finished off the last of their food stash, and they haven't seen so much as a squirrel in weeks. They're both slowly starving and freezing to death as they huddle in their shack, day after day with no end in sight. The man's wife is delirious with hunger. Fearing that they will soon be dead, he decides to go for a hunt. He musters the energy to bundle up and heads out, determined to stay out as long as it takes to find them both some food. A couple of days pass as the man takes shelter under impromptu stick shelters, keeping warm with a campfire in the nighttime and hunting in the daytime. Nearly frozen to death, mercifully the man spots a beautifully plump rabbit several yards away. He takes aim with his musket and bang. It's a perfect shot. With a newfound energy the man runs home, giddy to finally feast with his wife. What he doesn't know is that while he was gone, his wife had discovered some tasty flesh of her own. Literally, the hunger had driven her insane, causing her to believe that her now frost-bitten fingertips were lady finger cookies. She started off with a few nibbles here and there, slowly pulling the flesh away from her bones. After just a couple of hours both hands were nothing but bone. So she worked her way up her arms to the elbow. The feeling of something in her stomach just continued to drive her further, until she had chewed away at every last bit of skin she could reach, culminating in her chewing off her own lips. The husband approached the shack with his, now frozen, kill when he got an uneasy feeling. Fearing the worst, he steps up to the door and slowly opens it, expecting to see his wife's corpse shriveled on the floor. But instead what he finds is even worse. This zombie-like creature with exposed teeth and bones writhing on the floor at the sight of him, chomping its jaws with an insatiable hunger. At that point, one of the scouts screeched for the leader to stop, which I was extremely thankful for, as it was easily the most terrifying thing I had ever heard at the age of 7. The scout leader told it with real conviction too. Honestly still gives me the creeps if I go camping and happen to think about it sitting around a fire. Cold sweat smile. I've been telling this one since I was little. I love it. I hope you enjoy. It's not super scary, but it's nice and spooky, so hopefully you'll still like it. I work in the Nevada desert. A little facility out in the middle of nowhere. To get home it's about an hour drive of pretty much nothing. One day driving home, my car ran out of gas. I've always wondered if this dreaded day would come in. Here we are. I had no choice but to start walking. I always drove past this little roadside motel, so I guess I don't have much of a choice. I walked a couple miles until I got to it. I asked the front desk if they had any gas I could use. They said yes, but it would cost me. It was way too expensive. I didn't even have enough on me, so I had no choice but to clean dishes and do other odd jobs around the place for the rest of the night. By the end I had made enough money, but I was completely beat. No way I could drive after that. I asked if I could at least use a room for the night. Not wanting to cause an accident, the owner said yes. Thank God. Although what he said after surprised me to say the least. We have 2 rooms available. One's haunted, and there's another next to it. I laughed it off, figuring it was just him messing with me after the long day, friendly jokes. Just to be safe I chose the room next to it. When I got in there, what a dump. Just a shitty table with a shitty bed and a shitty broken fridge. I sat down on the bed, exhausted. I looked up to see there was a hole in the wall, about the size of a coin. Wow, how classy. Out of curiosity I looked through the hole with one eye. I saw the room next to mine. At the table, a young woman was seated brushing her long brown hair. She was beautiful, from the back at least. I didn't want to be a creep, so I just went to bed. A couple hours later I woke up with an uncomfortable feeling, just in the pit of my stomach, that something wasn't quite right. I sat up and saw the hole in the wall was now glowing. I kneeled back down to it and peered through. All I could see, was red. Bright, glowing red. I figured the woman had just placed something, I don't know, an electronic in front of the hole. I went back to bed, unable to shake the feeling. The next morning when I woke up, I headed straight to the front desk to get all paid so I could get the hell out. As I got the gas, I decided to ask the owner, "Hey, that woman in the room next to mine, is she alright?" I was getting kind of a bad feeling. The owner laughed at me. "Oh, so you saw her? She's the haunted room's resident." I laughed it off again, trying to continue to joke around with sarcasm. "Well, she's awfully pretty for a ghost." The owner handed me the gas tank. "Then you haven't seen her from the front. Her eyes are glowing red." I worked as a camp counselor for a few summers and had a great signature ghost story. I don't really remember too many of the details, but the gist was there was some ghost who would kill you unless you gave him 2 of your teeth and told him 2 other names of people to kill. It was a fine story, but the real kicker came at the end of the night. When all my baby teeth had been replaced with adult teeth, 2 of them never came in and were missing. For a few years I had a retainer with 2 fake teeth to fill the gaps. Before sending the kids off to bed, I would pop the retainer out in secret and give them a big old toothy smile. Scared the absolute bejesus out of the little buggers every time. Unfortunately, it's a true story, but the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. If you are not familiar, there are a couple of documentaries and 2 books that I know of on the subject. Absolutely horrifying. Makes it almost impossible to enjoy being out in the woods now. If you're interested, here is one of many links available. I went down the rabbit hole long ago, and ended up watching some YouTube documentaries and reading 2 different books, etc. Genuinely terrifying, and many still whisper the story when around a campfire. A boy is walking home late at night after football practice. There is another big game playing on TV tonight, so he wants to get home ASAP. Every time he walks home from practice, the boy passes by an old misty graveyard that his mom has told him never to go through. However, passing through the graveyard is a shortcut to his house, and the boy doesn't want to miss the game, so he hops the old rusty fence of the cemetery. And X200B. That night, the graveyard was very foggy, and the boy could barely see ahead of him. The boy was walking quickly through, when all of a sudden he falls into an unfilled grave. He lands upon an old wooden coffin with a thud. The hole is about 8 feet deep, out of the boy's reach. However, his quick wits realize he can lean the coffin against the hole to climb out. It works just as planned. And X200B. After exiting the hole and reaching the other side of the cemetery, the boy suddenly hears a loud chunk. Chunk, chunk. He turns around in surprise to discover the same wooden coffin rolling toward him. Immediately scared out of his mind, the boy frantically hops the fence and sprints home. He slams the door, locks it behind him, and shuts the curtains. He doesn't even think about the game once. The boy just sits on the couch in fear and waits. Silence. Chunk, chunk, chunk. The sound of the coffin slamming against the ground began to grow louder and louder outside. It stopped abruptly for a moment, only to follow a large crash of the old coffin slamming through the front window. The boy screams and quickly runs up the stairs. It is pretty late, so the boy's family is all asleep. He runs to his parents' room and frantically turns the knob. Locked. Chunk, chunk, chunk. The coffin is somehow now halfway up the stairs behind him. Sweating and in absolute fear, the boy runs to the bathroom down the hall and locks the door behind him. He balls up in the bathtub and tries to calm down. Chunk, chunk, chunk. Boom. The coffin breaks the door down and is within feet of the boy. Desperate and out of options, he starts throwing random toiletries at the coffin. He throws toothbrushes and nothing happens. Chunk, chunk, chunk. The coffin rolled closer. The boy threw a box of bandages. Nothing. Chunk, chunk, chunk. The coffin is mere inches away from the boy. Finally, the boy grabs some cough medicine, hurls it, and the coffin stopped. And X200B. There was a Brit who was driving through Ireland as the weather got progressively worse and day soon turned to night. He suddenly realized that he was on the wrong road, but there was nowhere to turn around, so he pressed on, barely able to see the road through the rain. Without warning, his car just died. No battery, no engine. He assumed water must have shorted something and he'd best start walking. He was soaking wet in 100 yards, but he continued walking. An hour later, he heard a noise behind him and turned to see a car coming very slowly up the road behind him, its lights very dim. As it reaches him, he reaches out through the torrential rain and opens the back door and jumps in. Shocked, he is the only person in the car. There is no one driving and no other passengers. He freezes with fear as the car slowly continues up the road through the pouring rain. Before long, a village comes into view and the car creeps silently and slowly into the village. The Brit spies a pub, so he jumps out and runs inside, not looking back. Panting with horror, he orders a beer and sits down. A minute later, two soaking wet Irishmen come into the pub. The taller one points at the Brit and says, "That's him, Paddy. That's the bastard I saw jump out of the car we were pushing." Gosh, let's see if I can recall it correctly. There was a body of a fairly large person, once found in the woods. They were quickly killed, and there was nothing extremely off about the scene, except he had half of his pointer, ring, and pinky finger all missing from his left hand. No one could find the missing fingers, and they never found any clues. A few weeks later, another body was found, another man who was a bit smaller than the previous guy. Same situation, quickly killed, and 3 fingers missing all from the left hand, and still no clues. A few more weeks went by, and this time it was a woman who was found, smaller than the second guy found, same fingers missing from the same hand. This went on for a while, with the victims getting smaller and smaller, until it was kids' bodies being found. One teenager's body, though, only had the ring finger and pinky finger removed. The police found a fingerprint at this crime scene, and they found it matched the prints from a theft record from the previous victim. The guy telling the story then told the kids that the killer was searching to replace his fingers, and so far, he had yet to see if the fingers of children their age would fit. He then took off his glove, showing he had a scarred pointer finger and was missing half his ring and pinky finger, and then lunged at the kids while screaming. He later told the kids he lost the two in a work accident, and doctors were able to save his very mangled pointer finger. He told this story every year at camp. Radio Silence, a no-sleep story by Bench Bartlett, which I will paste below, and NBSP, 36,400,000. That is the expected number of intelligent civilizations in our galaxy, according to Drake's famous equation. For the last 78 years, we had been broadcasting everything about us, our radio, our television, our history, our greatest discoveries, to the rest of the galaxy. We had been shouting our existence at the top of our lungs to the rest of the universe, wondering if we were alone. 36 million civilizations, yet in almost a century of listening, we hadn't heard a thing. We were alone. That was, until about 5 minutes ago. The transmission came on every transcendental multiple of hydrogen's frequency that we're listening to. Transcendental harmonics, things like hydrogen's frequency times pi, don't appear in nature, so I knew it had to be artificial. The signal pulsed on and off very quickly with incredibly uniform amplitudes. My initial reaction was that this was some sort of binary transmission. I measured 1679 pulses in the 1 minute that the transmission was active. After that, the silence resumed. The numbers didn't make any sense at first. They just seemed to be a random jumble of noise. But the pulses were so perfectly uniform, and on a frequency that was always so silent. They had to come from an artificial source. I looked over the transmission again, and my heart skipped a beat. 1679, that was the exact length of the Arecibo message sent out 40 years ago. I excitedly started arranging the bits in the original 73x23 rectangle. I didn't get more than halfway through before my hopes were confirmed. This was the exact same message. The numbers in binary, from 1 to 10. The atomic numbers of the elements that make up life. The formulas for our DNA nucleotides. Someone had been listening to us, and wanted us to know they were there. Then it came to me, this original message was transmitted only 40 years ago. This means that life must be at most 20 light-years away. A civilization within talking distance? This would revolutionize every field I have ever worked in, astrophysics, astrobiology, the signal is beeping again. This time, it is slow. Deliberate, even. It lasts just under 5 minutes, with a new bit coming in once per second. Though the computers are of course recording it, I start writing them down. 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0. I knew immediately this wasn't the same message as before. My mind races through the possibilities of what this could be. The transmission ends, having transmitted 248 bits. Surely this is too small for a meaningful message. What great message to another civilization can you possibly send with only 248 bits of information? On a computer, the only files that small would be limited to text. Was it possible? Were they really sending a message to us in our own language? Come to think of it, it's not that out of the question. We had been transmitting pretty much every language on Earth for the last 70 years. I begin to decipher with the first encoding scheme I could think of, ASCII. 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0. That's B.0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1. As I finish piecing together the message, my stomach sinks like an anchor. The words before me answer everything. Be quiet or they will hear you. My family had one called, the man in the corn, or, beans in the corn. There was once a hobo who was stealing ears of corn from a local man's garden. Now food was hard to come by, and someone stealing that which you're growing was especially frustrating. The man saw the hobo in the garden and fired a shotgun shot over the hobo's head. The next day, the hobo was back there again stealing ears of corn. The man decided he would teach the hobo a lesson, so he poured all the lead shot out of his shotgun shells and filled them with small dry beans. The very next day the hobo was back in the cornfield again, and the man fired twice on the hobo, and the hobo screamed and ran down the corn rows fast, pleading the whole way. The man watched for days, but the hobo was never seen again. Some days later, the man still had bean shells in his shotgun, so he aimed at a plank of wood standing over by his well. The plank ripped to pieces. When the next planting seasons came, the farmer walked his cornfield to its far corners, to cut corn husks and prepare to plow. Along the way, he found tiny bean plants coming up through the soil, one here, another there, all lining up to lead him to a big bunch of beans coming up along the edge of the field. When he went to examine the bunch of beans, he first saw shoes soles turned to one side, and then the outline of a body, sank in the mud and soil. He realized he had killed the hobo, and the random beans that had fallen out of his body had sprouted along the way. My father had bought that particular farm during the war years, and he said for 20 years, random bean plants would show up in that field. Any bean plant that showed up in our garden was given the chance to grow, and one year there was a bean planted that wrapped around a cornstalk. My father did not harvest the corn ears on that plant. I love this one short and just creepy enough. I had a roommate, friend of mine in college, decided one summer to solo hike through a bunch of Colorado. He's kinda odd. He's one of those kind of people that automatically thinks old stuff is better, that will only takes photos on film, and has a ridiculous record collection. But he's also pretty experienced camper, so no one was very worried about him. It's kinda soul-searching thing for him. But anyway, he goes off for 2 months and he comes back and he's telling me about his trip. It was amazing. Just out in nature. So many stars, that kind of stuff. And also, there were a couple days I felt like I was being watched, but I never met anyone on the trail. Super weird. I even thought I saw someone, but nope. A couple days later he gets his photos from the local film developer he uses. And he gets back to the apartment and shows me the photos like he always does, but he seems off. I'm looking through the photos, and there are beautiful landscapes, his camp set up, his breakfast, and then right in the middle of there are 4 photos of him in his sleeping bag. Sleeping. I got one. I was deer hunting near Hoona, Alaska with my dad. One night I have this weird dream. I see these beautiful white deer, buck and doe. I mean, like the type you take and get stuffed. I take a couple of shots, the buck gets away, but the doe falls over, dead. After skinning it up and going back to my truck, I hear a noise. As I turn, I see the buck again, but this time he looks angry. He looked beautiful the first time, this time? Nightmare fuel. We're talking flaming red eyes, antlers crawling into the sky, and his once white fur was covered in blood. As he charged, I screamed, and then woke up. I never forgot that dream. On a later camping trip, to a different location, as the fire grew dim, I decided to tell this dream as a campfire story. As I finished with, "It was scary, but I'm glad it was just a dream," my dad speaks up and tells me, "Son, that was the Hoona ghost deer." That's an actual myth told by the natives there. I was pretty shook hearing that. I always liked the quick ones. There was a young girl playing in her room one day when she heard a voice that sounded like her mother's from the kitchen. "Sweetie, come down here." The little girl jumped up and ran out the door, where she suddenly ran into her mother at the top of the stairs. Her mother reached out and quickly covered the girl's mouth so she couldn't make a sound. "Don't go down there, I heard it too," she said. When I was a kid, my mom told the scariest stories. We would beg her to tell one and always regret it after. This one really stuck with me. I don't know why. It's not a campfire story, but close enough. She had taken me, my siblings, and 2 of my friends to a nearby mountain, and we had spent the whole day hiking around. When we got back to the minivan, we discovered the side door had been left open. We all laughed, didn't think much of it, and piled in. The sun was setting and my friends were begging to hear one of my mom's famous scary stories, but I was begging them not to. Eventually she relented and started telling this tale. It started by describing the very day we just had, climbing around on the mountain rocks, having a good time. But unbeknownst to us, something was crawling down the mountain toward the parking lot. She described this creature in great detail. It was human, but missing its eyes, so it had to sniff around at the leaves to search for prey. It only had arms which it used to lope and drag its heavy torso across the ground, sniffing as it went. Eventually its nose proved true and it sniffed out our car, finding the open door and pulling itself in. It dragged its body underneath the back seats where we were sitting now. At this point it was dark, and we were getting tired. My mother knew this and warned us not to fall asleep because, in the story, the creature waited, hiding under the seats, watching our legs dancing in front of it. It waited until we began drifting off, then opened his mouth, revealing long sharp teeth, and bit into one of our legs. The girl it bit became petrified, sitting in the seat like a frozen zombie. It went through us one by one, while the mom in the story continued driving, assuming everyone in the back has fallen asleep. At this point, IRL, we had all pulled up legs up and were clutching our knees to our chest and sweating with panic. Eventually, in the story, the mom gets to my friend's house to drop them off. She calls out to them, and is surprised when no one answers back. Still, she assumes the kids are all sleeping. So she climbs out and opens the back door and is alarmed to find the children sitting in the back, eyes wide open, faces pale and already rotting. She tries to run and call for help, but before she can go anywhere, the thing gets her too. We were so freaking terrified. We went home the entire way curled up like that, and my legs ached so much. When we did get to my friend's house, my mom had to open the door for them so they could literally leap out of the car without once touching the floor of the inside of the car. My friends never asked her for another story after that. But, sadly, that was far from the last scary story for me. I don't really know of a name for this, but besides the ones you hear in elementary school like Black Box and the one with the girl and the dog, this is the one I know the best that's actually scary. A group of hikers were wandering through the woods looking for a place to stay at night when they came across a small cabin. They all decide to stay the night inside, seeing as there was no one there. Inside, the cabin is decorated with paintings of what seemed to be members of the family that used to own the cabin. The hikers spend the night looking at the paintings and making fun of how wonky they looked. In the morning, one wakes up to see the cabin full of morning light and looks around. The paintings are gone, in their place, windows.